Here we are, right, after a full day of practice. So sweet to be with you all again this evening. The title of tonight's talk is Purification, Medicine for All. Medicine for all, right? Last night I explored this dialectic, you recall, or maybe not, a balance between refuge, right? So finding some soothing or comfort or pleasantness, tranquility, and then manageable challenge. And we use the metaphor of a spider room, right? And we mentioned that it's important to, watch the level of intensity of our difficulties, whether physical sensations, thoughts, or emotions, right? It's all phenomenon, all of those things. And we want to maybe treat them the same. Sometimes we don't, right? Somehow we think emotions are somehow worse than physical, or physical sensations are somehow worse or more important, but we want to have an even playing field. They're all just passing neurobiological phenomenon. And in practice, we want to really, engage this dialectic dance when we need to. We talked about mindfulness as being a kind of systematic desensitization practice, which strengthens our capacity to feel what needs to be felt without fear, reactivity, or overwhelm. And also without pushing it away or suppressing it. And that's the middle way, right? A common theme in Buddhist psychology, the middle way. Not becoming possessed by an experience, but also not pushing it away. When we have a safe and sturdy refuge for those thoughts and emotions, the citta, by grounding in our body, our emotions, feelings, thoughts, the reactivity, right, that we experience can more readily move through us without intensifying. So all thoughts and emotions are passing phenomenon. And if we have this ground in our body, we could think of it as the roots of a tree, and the tree is not blown over when it's got strong, deep roots in the winds of life, right? Thoughts and emotions. The body is so important. The specific refuges we discussed were twofold. One is this body that we're talking about, and the other is the kind of peace and tranquility akin to the experience of the Buddha under the rose apple tree. And when the citta can be anchored in the body, either via immersing itself in pleasant and joy and tranquility, which causes an anchoring in the body, or through deliberate body-centered practices, the citta can know itself, right? Can self-reflect, like, what is it like to feel hopeless? What is that? Right? So you can be with it rather than be against it, right? And when the citta can be anchored in the body, it can also then, just as it can recognize its suffering, it can also see its own goodness, the beauty and goodness in every heart here. And how often do we recognize our basic goodness, right? Not so much. And then when the chitta is moored to the body, it can then grow compassion and wisdom, the heart and the mind, and prepare to enter the room. And so we've been exploring some body-centered practices today, and we had our standing and sitting meditation with Jen. We had some body-centered body scan later on, and we had our beautiful yoga practice with Shane. So we've been in the body, right? And I know from the practice meetings that there's been a whole variety of ways that you worked with the body today. So I know that some of you experienced the refuge of the body, or the sense of joy and tranquility found under the oak trees, or with the lilacs, or with the gobbling turkeys. And I know some of you encountered some manageable challenge along the way, some challenge that was not higher than maybe a 6 on the scale. And I know that some people had some more challenging experiences, higher. And I know that some of you then found refuge, made a choice, a different choice, maybe to go out in nature and bask in the beauty of nature as a way to soothe before returning to some of the challenges of practice. So I know that each of these variations happened, and I'm grateful for knowing how your practice went in the practice meetings. And so, as promised, I'll talk about purification. And when we think of that word, it can be a little off-putting, as if we are impure beings who have to purge ourselves of our defilements or something, right? And I've had resistance to that word over the years, but it helps to remember the use of language in the days of the Buddha, translation complications, and his tendency to drama, right? Such words for, that word defilements, right? It's such an unpleasant word. And I have in my life bristled at such language, especially when it was directed to people who are suffering, right? I mean, it can smack of blame on the suffering person. It can seem really cold. I mean, how often do we tell someone who's suffering that they need to purify themselves of their defilements? Of course, now I know, sort of the way the language works, and that the defilements or the poisons, or we can also use the term unwholesome mind states, are the root cause of suffering, and therefore they must be known, understood, and uprooted. We have to face them head on and call them out. That's the first step in purification. And along with the uprooting practice, we can also then nurture some wholesome mind states that could counteract the unwholesome mind states, which can make our heart less susceptible to poison. I think it helps to think of purification like the process of dialysis. Maybe when blood is filtered through that dialysis machine, and the machine removes toxins that build up when the kidneys aren't doing their filtering job. And when that happens, the blood is then a force of good. After that, it's medicine then. It's clean, purified blood is medicine for somebody who's sick. So we've transformed poison into medicine, right? Or when we purify water, let's say there's a whole community that's been suffering and ill because of water that's toxic in some way. And when we remove the poisons which are causing harm, that water becomes medicine, right? For everyone, for all. With Dharma purification, we're using practice as the dialysis machine. So we filter our unskillful habits of mind, the poisons, and we will talk about them. We filter these unskillful habits of mind through the wise awareness of our Vipassana magnifying glass. Right? So we use wise effort, wise mindfulness, wise concentration, to recognize the poisons, to recognize them, which is the first step in transforming poison into medicine. And you'll notice I just referenced the concentration or mental discipline grouping of the Eightfold Path that Jillian mentioned last night. So this is a little review of Buddhist psychology. Those principles are wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. So those work together to promote mental discipline and concentration so that we can stay with our experience enough so that we can know our suffering, right? We need that concentration. We need a certain amount of appropriate effort. And we need wise mindfulness, which is investigating, to know our suffering and to recognize, in fact, that there is a poison there. The poisons, we've been talking some in practice meetings today. It's amazing how that came up because unwholesome mind states, anytime you're suffering, most of you know by now, these are there, at least one of them. So the first one is greed. And we're not referring to greed for, money so much. We are referring to anything. We use other language: craving, clinging, wanting, desiring. It can range from, today I've noticed sort of a subtle sort of wanting of my certain Starbucks that I get in the morning. And in practice, particularly where we're training to look inside ourselves and look at what we're wanting in practice. So it might look like wanting to have an undistracted sit, wanting the mind to stop doing what it's doing, wanting to have a tranquil practice, wanting a comfortable body, wanting whatever isn't happening. And we suffer then. So the second poison is hatred, and hate is a strong word. I told my children that. It's a strong word, but it could mean resistance, aversion, pushing away, not liking, not wanting. Anytime you're not a fan of what's happening. So not wanting the racing thoughts, not wanting the various forms of physical discomforts we may be experiencing and that are common on retreat. And for us particularly, there are sort of complicated temperature things that we're all maybe challenged with, maybe learning from. Not wanting to feel whatever we're feeling, not wanting these intense emotions. Not wanting to think about work, right? All of the ways that we are not a fan of our experience, right? That's suffering, right? And the third poison, which is, it takes a little bit more getting your head around, is ignorance. Sometimes the word delusion is used. More modern, day language, we use that word ignorance because it's connected with ignore. So when we ignore the true cause of suffering and its end, or when we forget what the true cause of suffering is, right? And I want to deviate for a minute to clarify some things for some of the newer students. And some of you I invited to do a little research too into the Four Noble Truths and the three marks of existence. So hopefully these things aren't completely frightening to you, but there are about four main Dharma teachings, wisdom teachings, we call them, that ignorance is most often distilled down into. I mean, there are many wise teachings of the Dharma. There are lists upon lists, right? But ignorance most commonly is distilled down to four things. The first one being forgetting or ignoring that the cause of suffering is clinging. That's the second of the Four Noble Truths. You could just practice with that all day, every time you're suffering, and you could recognize that you forgot that the cause of suffering is clinging. You could just practice with that hour by hour. And the other three wisdom teachings that are prominent with ignorance have to do with the three marks of existence. And the more experienced practitioners and maybe less experienced. So I'll try to simplify them. The first of the three marks of existence is the immutable fact of impermanence. It's a fact that every single thing is in the process of arising and quenching without exception. When we expect things to stay the same and we're resisting change, we've forgotten or are ignoring that basic truth of impermanence. And so we suffer. The second mark of existence refers to the immutable fact that life is a difficult journey. When we forget that, and we kind of get our noses out of joint because, again, we're suffering and we shouldn't suffer, we have forgotten or are ignoring the basic fact of like difficulty, pain as an unavoidable part of life. Right? That word dukkha that you hear us say in the Pali is most closely translated to mean stress, but most closely of all, dissatisfactoriness. And so life is inherently dissatisfactory in so many ways, right? When we forget that or are ignoring that, we suffer, right? And the third of the three marks is a little bit more complicated, and newer practitioners maybe be gentle with yourselves. But the third one is not self, or anatta in Pali. And the best way to think of it is when we reflect on the fact that that word I am not my thoughts, I am not my emotions, my behavior, my sensations, my body, my accomplishments, my role, my job. I am not those things. Those things are all changeable, arising and passing. So how can I be those things, right? When we identify with impermanent things like these, emotions, a body, achievements, and so forth, we are ignoring or forgetting this immutable fact of not self, anatta. That nothing that is impermanent is self. And that nothing that is impermanent can bring lasting happiness. Which means that nothing can bring lasting happiness. No thing. Right? So to summarize the cluster of Dharma wisdom teachings that we are usually forgetting or ignoring when we're suffering, is that suffering is caused by clinging, the second of the Four Noble Truths. Things are impermanent. Life will have difficulty. And impermanent things are not self. Right? So these are the kind of teachings that we forget all the time, everybody, from moment to moment, including myself, right? So these three poisons, greed, hatred, and ignorance, are always to some extent with us when we're suffering, even in the smallest way. And somebody said today, well, it's not that because it's so small. And it's a continuum, right? There could be the slightest little bit of all the way to hatred, right? But it's all in that family of hatred, let's just say. And in fact, when we're suffering, usually more than one poison is in the mix. So, throughout the ages, assassins and poisoners often use a mix of a couple kinds of poison. One is usually the distraction, causing a lot of symptoms that eventually subside, and the other does the slow, dirty work. And that subtle poison builds over time, causing death, right? One such poison is dimethylmercury, for example. It's a subtle, slow killer in which the victim only knows they've been affected in the final stages. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. Hemlock works slowly also. But it turns out that arsenic is known to be the king of poisons, also the poison of kings. It's used to assassinate kings a lot, right? Because it's often untraceable as a source of murder. And here's the thing. I have decided, and this isn't just me, that ignorance is the king of Dharma poisons. Ignorance is the king of Dharma poisons. When there's greed or hatred, you will find ignorance in the background always. And ignorance is a slow poison. It's often not prominent. It's not as obviously painful as greed or hatred. It's stealthy and concealed, right? So here on retreat, we see a concoction of poisons arise quite often. That's one of the reasons we're here. When we become annoyed by the breathing of the yogi next to us, and we want them to move or take an antihistamine, we're poisoned by aversion, right? Hatred, aversion to the sound, which can translate to aversion to the person. It's amazing how that proliferates from a sense experience to a person, right? And then when we finally decide that that person is not moving, that we should move to an occasional chair, we're under the influence of greed, desire. We desire an undistracted sit. And along with these states, in the background is ignorance, right? We're forgetting that nothing brings lasting happiness. We're forgetting that suffering, which we might blame on the noisy breather or the noise, is caused by clinging, not the loud breather or the noise. A cocktail of Dharma poisons in one glass, or one sit, maybe. Another example of a concoction might be when we get disappointed or bothered because our sitting or walking meditation hasn't been tranquil. We haven't experienced refuge. We're affected by greed, clinging, right? And it seems innocent, doesn't it? Such a natural thing to seek tranquility on retreat. But when the seeking causes suffering, then we're under the influence of the poison, greed. And in the background, there's always ignorance. It goes without saying then that we're ignoring or forgetting the most prominent teachings of the Dharma. The source of suffering is clinging. Things are always changing. Life is inherently painful, and impermanent phenomena are not self and will never bring lasting happiness. So the good news is we can learn to use these Dharma skills to transform the poisons into medicine, like venom maybe, science can filter out the toxic parts of venom and use the rest as medicine, right? And last night I spoke of Dharma training that turns our heart into a work of art, right? But that work of art only can arise when we filter out these poisons. And the filtering process is what makes the heart a work of art. Right? So we can meet each of the poisons with awareness, clear seeing, and wisdom. We recognize them. Wow, that's a poison right there. We use that Vipassana magnifying glass to be curious what's happening right now when we're suffering. What is going on here? Which poison is it? And in addition, as I said, we can nourish alternative, wholesome habits of mind that are the opposite of the poisons. And they are the thing that will help transform the unskillful states into wholesome ones, like medicine, right? So there are two parts. We want to uproot the unwholesome state, like pulling weeds, maybe, and at the same time nurture the ground so that wholesome states can blossom. When I was in recovery from cancer years ago, post chemotherapy, I received several bone strengthening infusions. And this is because when the bones are dense, they're not a hospitable place for cancer to spread. In a similar way, we want to make our heart less susceptible to poison. We want to make the heart less hospitable. So we can bring out what is already wholesome and present in us, qualities we already have, like loving kindness or compassion, to strengthen the heart so that it is less hospitable to poison, right? So that first step, like I said, is wise attention, using our Vipassana training to magnify our ability to look deeply at our experience. So the minute momentary details, those subtle, the tiny blades of grass, right? The quiet instruments. So everything begins by first recognizing that we're suffering, not avoiding it, right? This is a moment of suffering. Ouch, right? There's no blood test for the Dharma poisons. The only way to see it is through your Vipassana magnifying glass, right? So you all are here now for 24 hours. What do you see in that Vipassana magnifying glass when the poisons are there? You must study this for yourself, right? But you can bet if you're suffering, there are poisons present. So you might ask yourself, which poison is this, right? Or maybe all of them are there. But the first step is always, this is a moment of suffering. And at the same time, then, dropping awareness into the body, mind in the body. So feeling the body, feeling it, not thinking it, feeling it, which might be your toe. Maybe all you feel is your toe. Wow, I'm hurting, I'm suffering, mind in the body. Tendrils of suffering dropping into the body, right? Will help you to be with your suffering more. Remember, we can be with our suffering more, the citta, all of that, and investigate it further when we drop awareness in the body. So you can investigate more strongly when you are embodied. And then you can recognize, is it greed? Is it hatred or ignorance? When your suffering is all impassioned and clingy and up here from the neck up, it's very difficult to identify which poison is there. So we've got to get down into the body. And let's start with craving or greed as an example. When we use wise attention and investigation and then detect craving when it's happening in the moment, it can lose some strength just by being seen. Sometimes quite a lot of strength, actually. It's like the weed gets a little looser somehow when we recognize it. We're not grabbing onto it quite as much. So one of my most common daily life cravings has to do with where my yoga mat is. Some of you know this. And there are legitimate reasons for this, having to do with my eyesight and astigmatism and blurriness, right? But nonetheless, I often rush to get to the studio with a sense of stress and clinging. Oh no, I need that spot. I won't be able to see. Oh no, stress. And so when I identify that, when I'm mindful and I'm using my wise concentration and can investigate and recognize stress for the greed that it is, I can simply say clinging, wanting. And when I do this in this circumstance, immediately my sense of urgency and stress diminishes it because I've called it out, right? Oh, my grip loosens, right? So just by recognizing and naming the poison, it can become weaker. And we can go further. We can like renounce it. Renunciation is a big word in Buddhism. We can banish it, which is not the same as thing as smushing it, right? Or shutting it down. We can not allow the poison to take any more hold. Maybe not in allowing it to take root, right? And then, on top of all of that, we can support the purification by nurturing those wholesome states. So, the wholesome states are kind of the opposite of poisons. So, with greed, we can cultivate fertile ground for the opposite of greed, which might be generosity or contentment, being content with how things are, right? We could change that to equanimity practice, right? So generosity, equanimity, also gratitude, So in my case, I could be just, remember to be content with what I do have. I could have gratitude for having such a wonderful yoga community so close to home, including beautiful Shane as a teacher that I get to practice with sometimes. Yeah. Or I could offer someone else the favorite spot on the floor, knowing that they may appreciate it also, just temporarily, for the sake of training forever. Not forever, because, well, my eyes, But in doing so, temporarily, my heart becomes less hospitable to greed, right? And as a review, last fall we reviewed 4 kinds of greed or 4 kinds of clinging. So a little review. It helps to know these 4 kinds so that we can more readily identify them when they sprout, different kinds of weeds, I guess, And they are 1, we cling to sense pleasures. And most of you know that. So eyes, ears, nose, taste, tongue, body, and mind, we cling to pleasantness, pleasant sights, pleasant tastes, pleasant sounds, pleasant smells, pleasant physical sensation, and pleasant thoughts and emotions. We like those, right? We cling to them, sense pleasures, right? And then we cling to views, fixed beliefs. My view, my belief is the right one. I have this vast belief about, ideologies of the world. And of course, it's right because it's mine. And then we cling to, let's say, success, achievement, the right way to do things. And my way of driving is the right way. My mother, who's 98 now, by the way, I don't know, some years ago, maybe when she was I don't know, 88. I don't know. And still driving. No, it was right when I started her driving places because we weren't going to let her drive anymore. I would be driving her home from my house in Penasquitos to her home in Poway. And I liked to go my way, and she liked to go her way. And every time we got to this one intersection, she would be like, no, you have to go this way because if you don't go that way, there will be a left turn over there. And when I was taught to drive in 1945, we were taught to make as few left turns as possible. And I'm like calculating how many left turns we have to go. I'm thinking, wow, I was not taught that when I learned to anybody. I don't know. I was not taught that. And I would say to her, Mom, I go this way because then this beautiful thing here I get to see. I get to see this beautiful park and sense pleasures. See, sense pleasures. And she'd be like, oh. And so every time we did that, and it happened a couple times a week, we'd get there. And of course, I'm the driver. I'm going to do it my way. That's my way, right? I would say, she would be like, no. And I would say, Mom, there's so many different ways to do things. You do it that way. I do it this way. Tomato. We had to do this many times, many times. And there came a time when she never did that again at that intersection. So that's, clinging to the right way to do things. And then we also cling to being a self, a me, the me, the mind, the I. We create this fabricated idea that we are a self, and we cling to that. And these habits of clinging served us well from an evolutionary perspective. That's how we got here. But today, mostly, they prevent us from happiness. And we come to the Dharma to increase our happiness and joy in a way that's not related to clinging. So in practice, when we recognize any of these kinds of clinging, using our mindfulness, our Vipassana training, the weed becomes looser. We see the weed in the ground. It's easier to pull out. And right then, in the very moment, you could offer a phrase of equanimity, like, may I accept things as they are. So here I am sort of clinging to, clinging to last night, not wanting a room that was 85 degrees and getting hotter by the minute. Clinging to wanting cool air, right? I could say, this is how it is. May I accept things as they are? So cultivating contentment, right? Or we could invoke generosity, envisioning other people having happiness, joy, and tranquility. And that would be appreciative joy, right? And now I know that there's something tricky in Lack Sadler, where if you just adjust that thermostat a little bit, one person gets raging hot and the other person is freezing. But now that I know that, when I'm suffering tonight, I can know that somebody else is happy. Right? I'm just saying, right? So I'm purifying my heart that way, right? So appreciative joy, right? Or we can engage in a generous act too. So rather than taking the last cookie, you can offer it to someone. And this is so connected to the precepts from last night, right? Generosity. So here, the poison of craving then has been transformed into medicine for all. So we have brought some wholesome parts of ourselves, equanimity, gratitude, generosity forward. And it doesn't just benefit me, it benefits everyone, right? The person who has the different temperature in their room, it benefits them. My contentment benefits people around me. When I'm remembering generosity rather than clinging, other people benefit. So the poison of greed has been transformed into medicine for all. So hatred, the next one, aversion, not liking, pushing away your experience. Anytime you're not a fan of something or you have your nose out of joint. Hatred, too, is discovered by mindfulness, right? Looking through that Vipassana magnifying glass, recognizing I'm suffering right now. I am not thrilled. And we can investigate, right? Grounding in the body, remember? In the body, suffering, body. Like first thing, suffering, body. And then we investigate it. Oh, this is hatred. I see this now. And then we can cultivate the opposite of hatred, which is what? Right? The opposite of hatred being love, right? So, loving kindness and compassion are the antidotes to hatred. And when we cultivate loving kindness and compassion, the heart is less hospitable to aversion, right? So, for example, here on retreat, if you develop an aversion to yourself, your own practice, how bad you are at it, with wise attention, then you can become aware of those thoughts. You can recognize the suffering, drop into your body, and then you're more readily able to investigate the cause. If you're not in your body, you'll be really busy swirling around with thoughts and emotions, and it will be more difficult to investigate the cause, right? Hatred, I see that, right? So you recognize hatred happening, and then you can counter it with self-compassion or loving kindness so that your heart is less hospitable for the poison of hatred. There's less room for it there. A heart filled with love has a hard time hating. A heart full of self-compassion is less likely to hate itself. So you've transformed the poison of aversion into the medicine of love. Yeah. So even a less painful example of my own, it's not as painful as the yoga mat thing, but one that still involves suffering and that happens to me on retreat is related to food. This mind here often gets caught up with the food. And I know it's crazy, right? Because it's so delicious here. But I think it might be because in the outside world, I barely think about food. So when I'm here, all of a sudden, like it's there 3 meals a day, right? It's cooked for me. It's right there, right? But the issue for me is these retreats can serve a lot of tofu, and I have a really bad sensitivity to it. It can really give me blinding migraines from the soy. So I have an aversion of just the word tofu. I hear it, tofu. I see it in food, and I already feel annoyed. And I get thoughts like, why do they have to serve tofu at every meal? Or don't they know there are other non-meat sources of protein? So there's a lot of aversion, aversion to the headaches, the discomfort, aversion to the word, the sight of it, even the people who cook it. I really proliferates. But, I'm saying this, but it's really just like a 1 or a 1.25 at most on a 10-point scale, right? But still, it is aversion, and I'm suffering, even in a small way. It's a tiny sprout of suffering that I can see with my Vipassana magnifying glass. And so, because we have so much time here, and I can't easily block out or smush or avoid that with maladaptive coping strategies, right? I get to use the Vipassana magnifying glass to recognize all of those aversions. That's a lot of aversions right there. And just by seeing them, I'm a little wiser. They have less power, right? And then when I cultivate love instead, my heart is less hospitable to the aversions. So when I'm compassionate to myself, I'm not so miserable when I have a headache. I whine less, right? When I offer loving kindness in my practice to the tofu eaters. And because loving kind, may you be happy, right? I want them to be happy and enjoy their food. And I have less aversion to them, right? And then I have less aversion to the tofu because I know it makes them happy, right? May you be happy, right? So my heart has become less hospitable a place for the poison of aversion to reside. The poison of aversion has been transformed into medicine for all, right? And that's purification, transforming poison into medicine for all, right? My loving kindness impacts everybody. And then finally, the third poison, ignorance, is a little different. It also, though, can be discovered through our Vipassana magnifying glass. But it conceals the true nature of things. When we're under the influence of ignorance, we think that things are permanent, self, and pleasurable. And so we have to use really deep investigation under and around those blades of grass to recognize what it is that we're forgetting or ignoring. We have to dive deep underneath the suffering. So when we're petulant about things not being how we want them to be, I'm too cold, I'm too hot, and they're not beds of nails, we're forgetting that life is a difficult journey. There will be difficulties and pain, right? When we're resisting change, we have forgotten that everything is constantly changing. There's nothing we can do about that. And when we forget that the self that we cling to is fabricated, an illusion, we suffer, right? So using the Vipassana magnifying glass, looking down through all the blades of grass to see what's really under there, what are we really forgetting, which aspect of the Dharma are we ignoring, we can recognize the ignorance that is there. And when we spend time in extended practice, like on retreat, the recognition of ignorance is more prominent. So the antidote to ignorance, like what's the opposite of ignorance, right? Wisdom, right? Ignorance, wisdom. So we're not necessarily calling in a heart practice as an antidote to ignorance. It's wisdom, the wisdom teachings of the Dharma, right? So with extended practice on retreat, we have a chance to, over repetition, over and over again, become more readily able to recognize when we're forgetting. When we read and study the Dharma and work with a teacher, we remember these Dharma principles more readily. Our wisdom gets stronger and stronger, and our heart mind becomes then a wiser, less hospitable place for ignorance to take hold. Because a wise heart has less room for ignorance, right? So there's room in this practice for study, working with a teacher, and extended retreat practice, right? With repetition like this, extended retreat practice, study, reading, working with a teacher, our Dharma study stays with us more easily. We recognize ignorance sooner and can transform it into medicine for all, because our wisdom is medicine for those around us, right? When we suffer less, we don't make others suffer, right? One way that ignorance can show up maybe on retreat is when we find ourselves turning an aching neck into my aching neck, right? That self thing right there. We have an aching neck, and then it becomes my aching neck, and that adds to the difficulty. It solidifies it, right? Or we might experience a mind state of sadness and think, I am sad. There's selfing again, right? When we self like that, we solidify it. It takes on more intensity. We harden around it. It becomes tangible. So we can always look for selfing when we're suffering. Always. We can also look for resisting change, or we can be curious whether we just have our nose at a joint because things are unpleasant. It's cold, you're sleepy, distracted all the time. Resisting the immutable fact that things can be hard. Resisting the immutable fact that things can be hard. So suffering is more than the sum of its parts. So we study here thoughts, physical sensations, and emotions. But when we're suffering, they're more than thoughts, physical sensations, and emotions. We've made them more. They're all tangled together in this, clump, a tangle, a skein. And when the Buddha said, "Who will untangle this tangle?" he was referring to that fact that our suffering, meaning the poisons, are a tangled or a clump of different aspects of our experience, thoughts, physical sensations, emotions. That's it, right? And our Vipassana training invites us to deconstruct our experience, to separate out the strands, to discern the individual thoughts, physical sensations, and emotions, so that they're not all clumped like this, so they can be seen clearly, so that they no longer trigger reactivity, so that they're just thoughts, sensations, and emotions. When we distill the poisons into their different strands, they're no longer poison. Like when we pull molecules apart into their different elements, like when we add baking soda to hydrochloric acid, the hydrochloric acid is broken down into salt and water. It becomes harmless and neutralized. So the Buddha said, when what is seen is merely what is seen, when what is heard is merely what is heard, when what is cognized is merely what is cognized, this is the end of suffering. Let's sit quietly for a bit before our walk.